Welcome to Beyond the Frontline podcast, where your host, U.S. Air Force veteran Donna Hoffmeyer, will help you transition from the front line to the home front. Listen every other Wednesday as we'll bring great conversations, resources, tips, and feel-good stories that will resonate and relate. Now, here's your host, Donna Hoffmeyer.
Hey everyone, it's Donna. I'm back with another episode of Beyond the Front Line. And this time I want to talk about passing trauma. Everybody's familiar with generational trauma. That became kind of a sexy term in probably the last decade or so. And people started understanding that our behaviors can get passed down to our children, right? So if we grew up in a survivalist family, like I grew up in a survivalist family, meaning that we had to work, we had to make that dollar in order to survive. Like we didn't have the passive income, we were not independently wealthy. My family was a farming family, and they needed to work all the time. They were always in survival mode. That gets passed on, right? So we see the behaviors, we mimic the behaviors, and we keep it going. And so that trauma, in the sense of like, you got to work hard, you got to suck it up, you got to do that, it can get passed on behaviorally. But what if I told you that there's another way that you can pass trauma on? And that's what we want to talk about today, something called epigenetics. And I will tell you a short story that veterans are known, we're stubborn. We all know that we're stubborn, and we don't often want to do things for ourselves. We often come across with, I'm okay. And recently with the PACT Act that came out, I was a friend of mine who's a veteran service officer, and for the civilian world, that is somebody that helps with applying for benefits, was talking to me and said, Donna, you need to apply for the PACT Act. The PACT Act is basically the VA now opening up claims for things like burn pits and all the toxins that we've had, like when we're on the flight line, sucking the jet fuel and all those fun things. And it's much more advanced than that, but that's just the basics. And I, did the normal veteran thing. Oh yeah, sure, and blew it off because I didn't want to reapply because it was just daunting. It was just too much effort. I just wasn't interested. And a little hypocritical as I am a veteran advocate. So he kept on me, and then one day said to me, do you know, Donna? He's like, you were a flight nurse, right? I said, yeah. And your husband was on the flight line. I said, yeah. Do you know that all that fuel that you were sucking in can actually have an impact, and your children could end up with ADHD? Now, he knew what he was saying because our oldest has ADHD, and it stopped me in my tracks. And I was like, oh, you got me. You knew what you were doing. And he just kind of smiled. So if sometimes we can't do stuff for ourselves because we're being stubborn or we're just not interested, all of us know that if something is going on that's impacting our children, we're going to change whatever that is to do it better. So back to what I was talking about, this term called epigenetics. And the cool thing is I was scrolling through, I think Instagram or something one day, and I see this lady talking about this thing called epigenetics, and I started reading her stuff, and I was just fascinated. So I reached out to her, and she was very graceful, and she said, hey, let's talk. And I have her on with me today, and her name is Bonnie Goff, and Bonnie Goff is a developmental psychologist and a UCLA lecturer. And so, Bonnie, I am so excited that you're here today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh my God. This is probably like the one podcast that, and I love all my podcasts, but I was so intrigued by this. And after you and I talked, I was like, oh, heck yeah, we really need to get this out. So I'm going to kind of let you talk about who you are, your background, and I'm just going to let you flow and we'll go from there.
Okay. All right. So I am a developmental psychologist. I studied here at UCLA. I specifically studied developmental neuroscience and was interested in understanding how early life trauma specifically, in the form of orphanage care, actually, children who do not have dedicated caregivers at the earliest stages of their lives, but then are adopted out, how and why do we see that the effects endure for a lifetime? Right? Why when they're 17, 22, 34, are they still struggling without even having had any explicit memory of what had happened to them? And so that's why I really became interested in understanding the effects of adversity and trauma. And so much of our understanding about the impact of particularly chronic stress comes from adult populations who have experienced chronic stress. And war veterans are a very common group that are investigated. And so a lot of our knowledge is sort of building off of what we know about individuals who have gone to war and experienced chronic stress and tend to show signs of PTSD, et cetera.
Yeah. So, and we just came out of, a very long campaign, 20 years, and that repeated, right? So I know that my husband personally was what they called an enabler. That means they went 6 months in, 6 months out, 6 months in, 6 months out. And there was a time when the Army was doing 18-month rotations. Those were insane. And they had like a break in between. So we were definitely privy to an exceptional amount of trauma. And, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but we are really good in the crisis. Like, you hear the stories like, how did they do that? These hero stories, the mother that lifted the car, the guy that, grabbed the kid and ran out of the road, the war stories of the guy that saved all his, buddies, and he had a broken leg. I think one of the craziest stories I heard, there was back in Vietnam, Operation Baby Lift, and there was 2 nurses. One of the planes crashed. There were 2 nurses on the plane. One didn't make it, and then the other one survived. And she was all these babies. They were moving babies out of the country. It was right at the end of the Vietnam War, and when they crashed, they got a helicopter in. They're offloading the babies. They're moving the babies, and she went to the senior officer that came on the scene. And she asked permission to be relieved of duty. And when he looked at her, she passed out. And they found out she had, and I don't have all the medical conditions she had, but she had like a broken hip and a broken leg and a broken back. I mean, it was some incredibly insane things. And she still managed to function and did that, right? So, you see all that, right? But then when it's over and it's all done and there's no more, that's when we start seeing the problems. And guess what? We had the big pullout that happened from Afghanistan. And now, and this is the hard part that I find. The pullout happens and we're out. And when everything's going on, it's like, oh, the service members, and don't forget them, and everything's going on. And that's not the time we need the resources, believe it or not as much. And then we pull out, and then everybody's forgetting, and those resources are kind of getting dwindly a little bit, and we're kind of forgotten. And that's when we need the most help.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think something a lot of people misunderstand about the stress response is that it's bad, that to stress your body out is bad, but that's not the intention of the stress response at all. It's an adaptive response. It's a survival response. It's what allows individuals in these acute moments of stress to do heroic, superhuman things.
Right.
It's incredible in that function. The problem comes when the stress is introduced over and over and over and over again. Essentially, it does something to break the system. And when you're out of that stressful situation, your body can't recognize that anymore. And so now what was once an adaptive response to keep you alive has become entirely maladaptive because there's a mismatch between your neurobiology and your environment. They don't match anymore. And that's what leaves people with conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder and, depression, anxiety, suicidality, et cetera.
So So we talked about, like I said in the beginning, we all understand generational trauma. It actually has become like almost like a normalized, like we can say it and people kind of nod their head like they're familiar with that. And I was familiar. When I learned that term, it explains so much, and I was like, wow, like it really helped me look at my family in a different way, in the sense of like they were only doing the best they could. They were handed down trauma and more trauma, that kind of thing. But then my generation, so my brother and I, we are the ones that are probably in the best spot. We are financially stable. We have passive income. We are not having to labor like every single day for the dollar, like every minute. So
Mhm.
scroll ahead, and now we have 2 kids, and my youngest is dealing with anxiety. And COVID just tore her up. I mean, that was really hard. And so in my head, I could kind of rationalize, like, yeah, lack of control and this and that. But my oldest wasn't doing it, but my youngest one was. And I was like, wow. I mean, they're 2 different kids, and we understand all that. But she does deal, and she's going to be that high functioning, and that's what she is. She's a high functioning kid. And I pick up on this, and I'm like, I think we're dealing with some anxiety. Now, I don't really get too bent on it and everything, but I help her manage it. We've done things like neurofeedback to kind of help manage. But it always left me scratching my head. And I was like, how in the world this girl have this much anxiety? She lives a pretty nice life. I mean, yes, there's been some things happen, but I mean, her life is pretty cushy.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, like,
Right.
talk to that. Like,
Yeah, okay. So it makes logical sense that intergenerational trauma exists. And I think we've all attributed that to behavioral transmission, right? You grow up in this environment, and then the next family sort of replicates that environment, or they're passing down their trauma through their own actions, their behaviors, their anxiety to you, and so on and so forth. And all of that is true. But what we didn't understand is this phenomenon called epigenetics. It's still a relatively um, new field, and there's a lot to learn. But what we're learning is that genetic changes can occur not just over very, very, very long periods of time, the way we consider evolutionary adaptation and gene mutations and those type of things. No, it's not that. Your genes can change their expression in real time based on environmental features. They essentially can be turned on and turned off through, there are a few different processes, but the most commonly understood is methylation. So essentially these methyl groups will sit on top of a gene and tell it what to do. And they
oh,
kind of, I always can think of them as like little bugs. They fly, they like hop around. And they are being driven by the environment. So those things can happen in real time. And that was the first sort of shocking bit of information. But then we found out that those same epigenetic changes can be passed down to future generations, and not just one generation, and not necessarily just 2 generations, but in mice, we've seen up to 6 generations.
wow.
Yeah, we haven't been able to study long enough to see in humans, but we've gotten to 2 generations worth of individuals who are inheriting the epigenetic changes that were created by the generations before them. And these are not, again, these are not gene mutations. This is not an actual shift in DNA. It's not the trading of a gene, a T. It is just the organization of these methyl groups. Which genes are being suppressed? Which genes are being expressed? That pattern of expression is heritable.
The methyl groups, is it a creation from stress? Or do they always
It's always
exist?
exist. They've always exist, but
Okay.
they seem to be paying attention to negative environments, stressful environments, adaptations that should be happening as quickly as possible, right? If the body is built to adapt and survive, we can change our genetic expression in the moment to facilitate our survival.
What
It's insane. It's wild.
I
We have
know,
no idea. But it
I,
would like take, like 20 generations, however many generations to actually for any sort of adaptation or, evolutionary change to occur, but that's just not the case.
so I feel like 4 questions in my head at the same time. It fascinates me. I mean, I'm like, whoa, it's like sci-fi.
Yeah, it is like sci-fi. It really is. And I want to share really quickly
Yeah.
one of the exciting experiments that was done in mice that kind of highlights this. And we use mice because we can control their environment very closely, and it gives us really detailed information. Because it's like, how are you going to tease apart the behavioral effects from the genetic effects?
Yeah, that was one of my questions.
The family is still doing what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
How do we know that this is your genes and not just like your mom treating you a certain way? Okay, so they had these male rats that they essentially conditioned and taught to fear the smell of, they've done this with many different things, but strawberries is one of them. Fear the smell of strawberries. They basically shocked them every time they saw a strawberry. It did enough times, the mouse learned, when I see strawberries, I feel pain. Now they're just afraid of strawberries by themselves. And then they take female mice who have who have no fear of strawberries, and breed them with these male mice who are afraid of strawberries, and then take the offspring and separate them from both parents. The offspring will never encounter mom or dad.
Oh.
It means they cannot signal to them behaviorally in any way to be afraid of the smell of strawberries. It's impossible. And yet, the offspring, when presented with strawberries, became afraid. And then their children, when presented with strawberries, became afraid. So now the grandchildren, and then one more generation. So now what happened to great grandpa and his fear of strawberries has been inherited 3 generations down without anybody ever, with no behavioral exposure whatsoever.
Yeah, you took out the behavioral part.
Right. And we typically think of a lot of these inheritances as coming from mothers, but we know that it's actually just as heritable via sperm.
Wow. So
because like the eggs are there. The eggs are there for your whole life. And so that would obviously have an influence. Sperm is being regenerated, on a daily, hourly basis, but it still somehow is able to hold on to that information.
And the methylene, what are they called again? The
methyl groups. Yeah,
methyl groups. Are they within the egg and the sperm? Are they already there? Are they?
Well, they are on your DNA.
Yeah.
When the egg and the sperm come together, we used to believe that all of that epigenetic information was stripped off of the DNA.
Yeah.
Epi means above. So they're basically things that are sitting atop the gene. Stripped off completely. And so you would be starting fresh with just the bare DNA of the sperm. But it turns out that's not true. We don't fully understand how and why the information, we understand the why, but we don't understand the how that information is still being transmitted, but it is. So it's both from the male and the female. The organization of their methylation patterns on their genes are heritable.
That it.
If you want, right? Okay, so here's the real science fiction part. This is the one that really boggles my mind. So the female fetus is born with all of the eggs, for the most part. There are a few exceptions. They have all of the eggs that they're going to have in their ovaries while they are in the womb. Okay, so the egg that made you was inside the body of your maternal grandmother.
Correct.
What was happening with your maternal grandmother when she was pregnant with your mom? Because epigenetic changes happen in real time. So the DNA, half of the DNA that created you was directly impacted by the environmental experiences of your maternal grandmother while she was pregnant with your mother.
Okay. And I'm like, like if you could see, I'm just sitting here like, holy crap.
It's science fiction. And if you think about it, that of course goes back every generation.
Yeah.
So it's like Russian nesting dolls.
Yeah.
Like where does it begin and end? It doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
Begs the question why we take the father's name.
Right.
Like the line is through the mom. Like obviously, but that's a separate.
We'll talk about that in another episode.
Sure.
So the word that keeps popping in my head, how do things like, does cortisol affect that? Does
Okay,
like,
so let's talk about it. Okay.
okay.
We know in war veterans that certain genes are changing their expression through epigenetic changes as a byproduct of the trauma that they've experienced. And the genes that are most commonly associated with those epigenetic changes are the ones that are associated with the stress response. So the genes that help regulate your stress response are the ones that are being impacted while experiencing trauma, which stands to reason, right?
Right, right.
So when we have these changes, a lot of them are acting on a system called the HPA axis. I don't know if that's familiar to you or any of your listeners. Okay. So a little bit of context. The stress response has multiple facets, and we have the stress response that is ready for in the moment issues.
Right.
The adrenaline, flip a car, right? That is adrenaline. That's adrenaline in your body. But you can only maintain that level of energy expenditure for a very, very short period of
Right.
time. Our bodies have a backup system for chronic stress. If we have used up the entire source of adrenaline and we're still in danger, we're going to fall back onto what is called the HPA axis. And the HPA axis is responsible for the release of cortisol. That's where the cortisol piece comes in. The initial response is primarily adrenaline, some cortisol, but primarily adrenaline.
Right.
Long-term chronic stress is the one that's associated with cortisol. And that is the output of the HPA axis. So the genes that are helping to regulate the function of the HPA axis are commonly implicated in epigenetic change following war.
So, well, right. And then you can become, I mean, we hear the term adrenal fatigue,
Right.
or you have no more cortisol.
Glands are releasing cortisol.
Cortisol, right. You go in adrenal fatigue and there's no more, like, you're tapped, like there's nothing left. And so people are like, how come I can't respond like I used to? Or how come I can't? I'm like, you used it all.
That's right. That's right. There seems to be, it may or may not be having used it all. The term adrenal fatigue, I think, is used colloquially. It isn't as much
clinical
supported by the science, but
right.
it very much aligns with this function of the HPA axis. The last step of the HPA axis, basically from the brain to your kidneys where the adrenal glands sit, is the release of cortisol. So the way that the HPA axis works is it's a loop. It has a negative feedback loop. It's almost like a gas pump in that once it has expended a certain amount of cortisol, that cortisol will feed back into the HPA axis to say, okay, that's enough. The same way that when your gas tank is full, it would.
Oh, gotcha. So like when
shut it down.
Okay.
So that you're not always going, because it's not made to be always going. It should, turn on when it must and then shut down. That would be a healthy response. But if it's being activated over and over and over and over and over, the mechanism of the pump can break.
Just overuse.
It's overused, and the brain's sensitivity to knowing when to shut it off is lost because there's always cortisol. What's going on. Now, what's really interesting about veterans is that we've always associated individuals who have experienced trauma with high cortisol, right? More cortisol is bad.
I've read this. It's actually not. Right.
The opposite. And for the researchers who first discovered this, they were just torn to shreds over it. In fact, advocates for veterans were saying, don't publish this data. You're going to undermine our agenda. You're going to confirm to people that this is just all in their heads. They have low cortisol. And so it was really confusing to the scientific community until it was validated by Holocaust survivors who had PTSD, who also had low cortisol. And so now we had even more evidence to suggest, okay, this can go either way. And there are only still now certain hypotheses as to why it's low cortisol. It seems to be associated with these more extreme conditions of trauma, more prolonged periods of trauma. Things like going to war and the Holocaust are not the same as getting into a car accident, right?
Right. Well, is it what, either we talked about it or I read, maybe both, but is it because, so when you say, oh, they have low cortisol, are we saying it is as in quantifying, like I make it up, like I have 100 units of cortisol and that's a normal level, and you have 50 units of cortisol. And so when the event happens that needs us to pump it, we don't have enough to pump. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes. So
okay,
that's one of the hypotheses.
right,
Again, because this is that negative feedback loop, one of the other hypotheses is that these individuals who have experienced prolonged stress in the form of war have created a hypersensitivity to cortisol in their HPA axis, which is actually forcing it to turn off prematurely, right? Like
oh,
the pump breaks, and it can break to release more, and it can also break to withhold. It's not
yeah,
not clear. It's broken. That's what matters. And that's problematic because we think of cortisol as not really being great for us, but we need cortisol. Again, the stress response is an adaptive one. Cortisol helps to regulate the inflammatory response in the body, immune
right.
regulation, metabolism. It plays a large role in the consolidation of emotionally salient memories. It helps to process and
Okay,
consolidate.
so that, right, like you're nodding your head, you're like, yeah, you get it. Like, so here we are, like memory issues, can't remember, uh, you know,
Mhm.
can't remember all the moments, or like, I am guilty of that. Matter of fact, my husband's like, you don't remember this, like from childhood, like he'll say all these things, and I'm like, how do you remember such detail? And I just have little spotty pictures. Like I don't have like a flow of information.
I lost you for a minute there, Donna. You
Oh,
froze.
yeah, you did too, but I think
And
we're
I heard
okay.
you say, my husband said.
Well, so I was saying my husband said that he noticed, like when we were talking about childhood stuff, I didn't, like he would remember stuff in great detail. And I'm like, how do you remember so much detail? Like I have flash of pictures. I don't have a straw, like a string, a linear memory of things. Like I have things that stand out. And to me, I just think that was normal. Like it's been so many years. Why would you remember all these things? But he even pointed out, he's like, I don't know. He goes, you just have very uh, specific, maybe, but it's just not as detailed. And then, those books like Leave Your Legacy. So I was going to like write stuff out for my kids and I started it. Yeah, I got really frustrated with it. I couldn't answer the questions. I was just like, I don't know. Like I couldn't answer them. And so I just put the book down. It's actually still sitting on my nightstand. And I really was very mad because I was like, I can't. And so that was when he was like, interesting. So, so just the
Right.
thought, I would be curious exactly that. Like, and I want to go get
Mm.
my cortisol level checked just for fun. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think the memory issue is an obvious one.
Mm-hmm.
The the loss of memories or the inability to recall certain information is certainly associated with trauma. But the other piece that's connected with the cortisol is that when those emotional memories are not given the opportunity to be processed and integrated into our long-term memory, they're sort of left floating.
Yeah.
And think about PTSD, like the fear-related memories just on a loop.
Flashbacks. Yeah.
They don't have anywhere to go. They have not been
Right.
processed, have not been stored. So they clump together into a mass. Memory is not my area of specialty, but this is what I know. Cortisol is meant to help you
Process
process, integrate, and pack it away,
and move
right?
on. Yeah. Where it needs to be in a
If
healthy
you're,
way. We
that's
can
right.
pack a lot of stuff away, but it's just not like hoarders, not in a
Exactly.
good
Yeah.
way.
Not suppress, but yeah, have actually processed, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and so if you have low cortisol, your brain and body don't have the opportunity to properly process those memories, which is why a lot of the interventions are associated with things like processing.
Well, and
Emotion.
that's interesting you say that. Okay, it's a little bit off track of this, but this is something I'm actually working on right now, kind of advocating, is that when they go, so we talk about post exposure therapy, right? So the whole concept is like, and I'm not a therapist, I just kind of had way too many therapist friends that I worked with, so I learned this stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And so the whole concept is that they say the story over and over and over and they desensitize. And that's the basics. I know there's a lot more to it, but that's just the basics, right? So some of these people are just like, no go. I literally had a service member that we had to stop. The therapist, like, I had to stop. His blood pressure went through the roof and they had to
Right.
start him on blood pressure medication. Like he couldn't regulate. So in my head, I'm like, why are we not finding the modalities that they can start with that decreases this inflammation, right? Because the reason why we don't want to talk about it is because, one, like you said, there's these floating memories around that haven't been processed right. And when we do go talk about it, we have a fight, flight, or fright response. Who the heck wants to talk about that? When you know you're going to react, like you don't want to because you're like, no, I'm not going there.
Right. Nobody
So,
wants to put their hand in the fire. Like, why
yeah,
would you do that on
is there a,
purpose?
right? And is there a place for talk therapy? Absolutely. I mean, absolutely, absolutely. But what if we could be starting a different way and we could be doing things like neurofeedback and EMDR and equine therapy, all these things that nobody has to talk about anything, but it
Right.
allows the body to process. EMDR and neurofeedback are just like peanut butter and jelly. They work so well together, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so actually we're kind of working on this over here, and I'm like, why do you want to go stick them in talk therapy when they have a reaction? I had a service member, I kid you not, I had a veteran. I work with veteran treatment courts, and I had one. It was like after their court day, and they had all come out, and we were all talking. And I was mentioning something about this, what if you could do therapy, but in a way that you didn't have to talk about it, right? And he starts telling me, he goes, I tried therapy, it didn't work so well. He's like, why do I want to go tell them about a nightmare I just had? Like, do you tell people about your nightmares? And I was like, that's a valid point. And he said, and then they put me in group and they thought maybe group better. He goes, and that didn't go well. And I said, what happened? And he said, well, there was a kid that was in there. So there was a kid that was in like tech school. In Army, they call it AIT. And he was struggling with PTSD. And this guy, who's an old veteran, right? He's like, can you believe it? Here's this young kid in AIT, and he's got PTSD. Of course, in my mind, I think, ooh, was there an MST involved? Like something happened, right? Because that's not typical, right? To be dealing with that kind of thing so early. And so
Hmm.
I didn't say anything. I'm just listening. And he goes, so I choked him out. And I was like, you what? He reacted so
Yeah.
fast. He put him
Yeah.
in a chokehold. He was so
Yeah.
mad. His body responded, right? And I said to him, I said, what if that same thing could happen? Like the same situation could happen, and maybe you only called him like a dumbass. And he's like, well, I think I called him that too. And I was like, but you never went and physically choked him out. And what was super funny was, and not funny, but interesting, was his response. He actually thought about it. Like, huh. Because I don't think that when these guys do these responses, and girls, when these responses happen, these are reactions. Like they're going in fight mode. That's what they
Yeah.
just did. Something flips and they go into fight mode, or they go into freeze, or they go into flight, right? But when the bad things happen, it's like fight mode, right?
That's right. That's right. And there's a good explanation for why that's happening. So, like you said, there is absolutely a place for talk therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's pushed so hard because we have the most evidence to suggest that it's effective. It's been
Mm-hmm.
around forever and ever, right? Since
Mm-hmm.
Freud was around asking us about our mothers. Um, but it is limited in its function, particularly in cases of trauma, because CBT is addressing the cortex of your brain, the parts of your brain that are logical and that can reason about things and that try to make sense of bad experiences and traumas that we've experienced. But that is not where the trauma lives. The trauma lives in the regions below the cortex, the limbic system, the emotional brain. And the emotional brain is more powerful than the cognitive brain. Think about it. You hear a loud sound, you jump before it dawns on you that that was just a door slamming, because we are built to be, better safe than sorry. That's just the human condition. So when those regions are activated, the cortex doesn't stand a chance. You can't reason away your trauma.
Right. So that's what I mean. So we're talking again, not bashing the talk therapy world, because it absolutely is a place for acute things that you need to process and go through and things like that. And even long stuff, you can work stuff out. But when you're dealing with a severe trauma and you go, hey, go talk about it. You're like, are you kidding? Like, you want me to, tell you?
You're just going to trigger. Yeah. You're just going to trigger.
Yeah.
Trigger.
You're re-traumatized, right? You end up getting re-traumatized out of that. So I'm just like,
even the desensitization stuff, there's a place for it, but it doesn't work for everyone, and it can actually make things worse.
Harder. So here we are, all this, bringing it back to epigenetics, all this going on, and we are not getting treated because we can't, for whatever reason, like we just can't do it. I don't feel like I can do it, whatever. Because this is what we're offered, something that's not necessarily working for our level of trauma right now, right?
CBT is what's offered in terms of... Okay.
And so, post-exposure is one, CBT, behavioral therapy is another one, so, you have PT and CBT and, all kinds of, and I know there's lots of stuff. DBT, I think, is another one.
All behavioral, though.
Yes, all behavioral. And I'm like,
we're sitting on the surface of the problem.
Right. And so how do you change a behavior that's a reaction? Like, that doesn't make sense to me, right?
Exactly.
Like,
when you start with the behavior, you're missing the root of the problem.
Yeah.
Behaviors don't fall out of the sky. They're in response to something. They are communication of something, either being right or wrong. Yes.
So then if we're not getting treated and that's not happening now, and then we have children, and let's say you have children, maybe you've dealt with generational trauma, and now there's a behavioral component, and then you're dealing with war, and now maybe you had a baby later, and now you're dealing with an epigenetic and a generational trauma. Like, what chance are we giving our kids?
Right. Okay. Let's get to the good news, shall we?
Well, I was just going to say, I was like, so that was my question. Like, so we have this, so that sounds all sad. What's the good part of this?
Yeah. That all sounds very, very doomsday and deterministic and overwhelming. But here's the thing. So we explained that epigenetic changes can happen in real time. That means that the changes that happen that have had negative effects can be reversed in real time. Epigenetic change does not favor negative events over positive events in terms of adaptation. We understand positive events much less in science.
Isn't that interesting?
Harder to quantify, and and we're trying to, help the people who have problems, but it's a separate conversation again. But yes, so epigenetic change, it goes both ways. So you can do things to change your epigenetic profile in real time, and that becomes heritable. And if you're done having kids, you can teach your children how to elicit their own epigenetic changes. And those come through a lot of different modalities. But if we're talking about getting away from traditional therapies that are focused on behaviors and thoughts, right? Thoughts and behaviors are the thing that sit above the trauma, the root of the problem. So if we want to get to the root of the problem, neurofeedback, EMDR, there are approaches that allow you to process painful emotional memories without having to cognitively access them. And that is remarkable. And I think people think that it couldn't be true. Again, it feels very science fiction-y. What do you mean I'm going to put like two balls in each of my hand and watch something go back and forth between my eyes, and I'm going to think a thought, and that's going to help me process this trauma. But it does, and it
Right.
will. And we do have scientific evidence to support the efficacy of those modalities that just seem a little bit out there. But that's the only way to get to your subconscious. You cannot access the trauma with your conscious mind. You can't.
Right.
Sense that you would need some sort of workaround, some sort of, subconscious approach to actually make the corrections. The other incredible research that's coming out right now that I'm so freaking excited about is psychedelic-assisted therapy.
That is coming back big time.
It is coming back big time. This is something that we have known about for decades.
The veteran community is all about that.
Right, because the information was suppressed in the first place.
Yes.
Sure that we could draft people into a war.
Yep.
There's a whole history behind that. So
there
I can
is.
imagine. But we're coming out of that, Nixon era of suppression of medication that can be so helpful.
Yeah, they changed the schedule on it. They made it like a schedule. I can't remember but they changed the schedule. So then all of a sudden it's like illegal.
Right.
Like
yeah. And it must be bad and horrible and evil, and only associated with recreation.
Mm-hmm.
Not true at all. And so now that the researchers are really back in it, USC and Yale and a lot of the really prominent universities are coming out with this fantastic research that is just mind-boggling in terms of its efficacy. Like this is the greatest growth in mental health care intervention that we have seen historically. Like, period. It's just going to be that big.
You can feel the change too, because people are demanding better, like we're not going to accept that, we're not going to accept. So it's funny, sometimes I'll hear, I was raised traditional medicine. I went to school, nursing, traditional, all that stuff. Weirdly, I never, not that I didn't subscribe to it. It's just, I knew there was more like that. I knew there was more, there were better ways. And, traditional medicine is symptom-based. You have a symptom, we correct the symptom. It's not root cause. It's the difference when somebody's like, well, what's functional medicine mean? I'm like, because they actually try to find what the problem is. And traditional medicine is managed by symptoms, Fair enough,
Yeah. Western medicine, when you're in an emergency room with head trauma, the best.
That's where you want to be. Yeah.
That's exactly where you want to be. We can fix the problem that we can see right in front of us.
Yes.
But it falls apart when we're talking about chronic issues.
Yes, there's no chronicity. Actually, I had a veteran tell me today. He's like, so I went to the doctor and they were trying to give me my pneumonia vaccine. And I'm like, okay. And I know this person's history, and I don't think that's smart until they figure out everything where he's at, like don't add more to the problem. And I didn't say anything. I'm just listening. And then he's like, and then somehow in there, they give me paperwork, or he looked something up or whatever, and he noticed he had nodules in his lung and nobody told him. And I was like, okay, so just based on that, I wouldn't add anything to your problem list. Like, I probably wouldn't do a vaccine. And I said, believe it or not, I'm not against them. It's just there's a time and a place, and there's a reason why we try to develop herd immunity for people that shouldn't be getting it, Yeah, yes. I said I really just think we miss a big part of that, So anyways, it's just interesting. It's like now we are demanding better. And it's throwing the traditional world kind of on their ear, like, whoa, wait, And the stuff that we call alternative medicine or alternative approaches or alternative modalities, I'm sorry, I just don't think neurofeedback should be an alternative. I think it should be a first line. I think EMDR should be first line. I think that you should go pat a horse with a therapist that knows what they're doing, I really think we start there. And then when I just think of it like this person that's very inflamed, really, really inflamed. And we just bring that all down and then be like, okay, it's like, so what's left? You still maybe need to work out. Maybe you need to talk through that issue and, but then again, you might not, because if you do EMDR, and for the community if you don't understand what EMDR is, the short version of this is that I think it was the lady was Frances Shapiro was the developer of this, and she noticed when she went walking and she was having a problem, she would look down at her feet and she would follow her feet. And she very obviously a very, very, very smart person, because then she's like, wait a minute, there's something here. So the whole thing is that when you do the eye movement, you literally follow something going back and forth. And then they ask you to think through a situation that happened. And they want you to do that because what happens is you unlock, and correct me if I'm off here, but you unlock this subconscious area that allows you to process this memory in a healthy way. And then, as Bonnie said, you can put it away on the shelf in a nice way, not like we do it where we just shove it into Pandora's box and pray to God that that closes and shove it into our hoarder house. That's how we do it. So it's a healthy processing, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And to be clear, when you think about it, you don't have to say it out loud, which I think is really important,
right? Because
not everybody wants to speak about it. And when you're with an EMDR practitioner, they won't ask you to share the memory. You don't have to. So that, I think, allows people a certain level of, hopefully, freedom to just really dig in there and not worry about saying something that, is either going to trigger them or somebody else. But yeah, it absolutely works. We have scientific evidence to support it. I think these things still kind of linger in the alternative medicine world because we don't have as much scientific evidence to support it, but that's only because they're newer modalities and they haven't been studied as much. But the research is nobody's on the fence. Nobody's saying, oh, it doesn't work. No, it works. We just don't have a huge body of literature on it yet. So it's like, when I think of things like CBT or the traditional, approaches from a public health perspective, it's the equivalent of saying to somebody whose laptop isn't working, have you tried turning off the power and turning it back on again? It's just like the most baseline, like it's not considering any nuance. It's not considering any individualized anything. It's just like, what's the most basic,
Frontline
approach that we but that's not what people need. They need it to be individualized and specialized to whatever it is that they're dealing with. And trauma is unique in its presentation.
And it's unfortunate the military has not picked up on this better. Although I shouldn't say they haven't, because I know they have. I know neurofeedback is done in the special forces. They do this stuff, right? Because when you put $1 million into somebody, $1 million plus, you don't want that asset going out the door that quick. You want to preserve that asset. So they're bringing all this stuff in, and I'm like, well, you could do this with everybody, and you could preserve your team. You could actually do some of this work ahead of time before they deploy. Actually, I was just told, somebody had told me Fort Hood, or Fort Cavazos now, used to, they lost the grant or the money ran out or whatever, that they actually used to do like neurofeedback before these guys would deploy. And people are like, well, before, because that helps you be more resilient. And so when you come back, it's not as bad. If you can process this in a healthy way, two things are happening here. One, you're going to have a better quality of life. Two, you are going to have a better quality of life for your children and for everybody around that impacts it, right? Like, so if you just want to be like that old Sarge guy that, I'm fine. Okay, fine. You look at your kids and you determine what they deserve. And if we need to put it that point blank, so be it, right? Because somebody stopped me in my tracks as soon as they said, hey, the stuff that you were sucking up during Bosnia over there could have an impact, and probably had an impact on your child that now has ADHD. And I'm like, stop me in my tracks. Okay, I will now do something that might benefit him in the future, with a claim or, whatnot, but protects him.
That you wouldn't do for yourself.
That I'm over here not doing for myself, which is really hypocritical. So when I heard this, I was like, oh, heck yeah. Like, people need to understand this. Like, we are impacting our children. And on a good note, I think personally that us waking up to just generational trauma, I have heard more times people say, I'm breaking the cycle. I'm breaking the trauma. I'm not going to do it. So every time we work towards that, so you break that generational and you do things to break the generational trauma, you actually are going to help in the epigenetic department, right? There's less chance that we're going to move this onto our children and we're going to teach them better.
God, I wish every parent knew that. I
Yeah.
wish parents could understand that. They don't. They think that there's something inherently within children that makes them want to be bad. And that's just fundamentally false. They're not. And when you're seeing bad behavior, it is a symptom. It's a symptom.
Every time.
Communication that something's wrong. And I think it is so incredibly critical. You know, I think a lot of adults, the expression, children are resilient. Yes, they are, but it is really misunderstood. What we're really trying to say is children are very plastic. They're very adaptable. But that adaptation can go both ways. So they can adapt to things being better, but they will also adapt very quickly to things being worse.
Yes.
And that can sort of lock itself in the brain during different early periods in your life where you go on and you're like, why am I still dealing with this thing that happened a million years ago? I should be over it. It should be done. Your brain kind of decided a long time ago, we're going to hold on to this. And so helping kids out while they're still kids is the best thing you can do. Like early intervention is everything. And I did want to make sure that we highlight for people who don't necessarily have access to medical care that would allow them to do EMDR or psychedelic-assisted therapy, which is becoming legal in California for anybody who wants to head on over here. Or you can go to Sweden, you know, Europe has already figured this out. Things like, I mean, I just hate to even say it, but like mindfulness meditation.
Yes.
There's much evidence. I mean, and the reason I hate to say it is because it's such a pain in the ass. I hate mindfulness meditation. My brain is not interested in being quiet ever. You know, like it's so hard. It's so hard.
Yeah.
And it's painful. It's yucky. I get sweaty. It's just like
I'm writing a grocery list instead, and I'm like,
I'm doing anything but being quiet, right? So it's really challenging, but oh my God, do we have evidence to suggest that
it does work? Yeah.
Teaching children how to do mindfulness.
Our school, yes. So our school brought in a person. She was a therapist, and she did mindfulness with the kids, right? So Bianca's going through all this, you know, COVID, and we're having meltdowns 3-4 times a week. I mean, it was full on. Oh my gosh, she was only 3rd grade and 4th grade, and it was horrible. And the teachers were just so understanding and caring. I mean, they all probably have PTSD from it, and I remember when she'd get overwhelmed, she would do like the bumblebee. So she'd plug her ears and she would hum. And it was like a reaction. Like she responded just like that. Like if it was too, she's like, "Mommy, I can't talk." Like, and she would just get really upset, and then she would plug her ears, and then she'd hum, and I'd be like, "Whoa, okay, you do your." But she learned that from the teacher, from the Mary who came in and did all this, and it was. I mean, I think it saved her a number of times, you know.
And adults ought to know it too. It's called bumblebee breath, and it is actually an old yogic practice. It's been around for centuries, of course, and we're just coming around to it here. But what it's doing is it's causing the vagus nerve to vibrate. So everything we've been talking about in terms of the stress response is regarding the sympathetic nervous system. But you have the counterbalance to that, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. And so if we have fight or flight, we have rest and digest, right? And when you really strengthen the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't stand a chance, right? It's trying like, everybody calm down. It's like, forget it. We're taking off. But you can do things to work to strengthen the parasympathetic nervous system. And that comes through activation of the vagus nerve. And I mean literal physical activation of the nerve. It's not a psychological phenomenon.
They're literally vibrating that nerve. By
vibrating it helps strengthen the parasympathetic nervous system. There's so much exciting information connected to that, and it's connected to the gut-brain axis and all of the bacteria in our gut and how that affects our minds, and it's just wild. But things like humming stimulate the vagus nerve.
Yeah.
Things like rubbing in this little piece of your ear on the top.
Oh yeah, the top inner corner. Yeah.
Activates the vagus nerve. I've seen these new devices. I'm so curious. I kind of want one where you put it around your neck and it just taps.
Oh, interesting.
And people are reporting incredible effects. So again, there's these workarounds to traditional modalities of therapy that feel so painful and yucky. that can really, really help. Imagine just putting something on your neck that
And
we
it
tap
calms
during,
you.
actually giving you some relief. There's so many, if anyone just Googles how to activate the vagus
Vagus
nerve,
nerve.
you'll find a million things, and they're all kind of silly seeming, and they work.
That's where
And they work.
EFT is, right? Is that the premise of EFT? Like well, not necessarily vagus nerve, but
Okay.
I mean at
You mean,
specific
the
points.
emotional, like tapping, emotional
Yeah.
freedom technique? Okay, no, but I'm obsessed with EFT because it's rooted in Chinese medicine
Right,
and
right.
energy meridian. So it actually is not about the vagus nerve. We don't have
Interesting.
good scientific understanding about why it works, but we have lots of scientific evidence that it works. And it was first recommended to me by my own psychiatrist. And I tried it and I was blown away by the effects. I have never served in a war, but I had a traumatic childhood. And so
Yeah.
here I am. That's my reason for being interested in
Right.
this.
And doing all that.
Right? Yeah. And so I went back to her and said, why does that work? How does it work? Like you're literally tapping, your eyebrow and under your nose and your armpit, and like
You're like,
bizarre,
this is so
right?
bizarre.
I was tapping my armpit. You look like a crazy person while you're doing it. And she said, oh, we have absolutely no idea. I
But we
mean,
just know it works.
Chinese medicine practitioners would say this is pushing energy through the body to be processed in a way that
Yeah.
through just energy meridians, whatever that means.
Well, I do acupuncture religiously.
Exactly.
I am a huge
And we know
acupuncture
that
fan.
it works too. I don't think we always have to understand the mechanism by which something works to acknowledge that it's effective.
Well, let's put it this way. We pop pills and we don't understand the mechanism. So if we're gonna go pop pills,
Oh, I've never thought of that. That is an excellent argument.
we don't know them. As a matter of fact, I kind of stumped our pediatric doctor. She's super nice. Like I really liked her. She was new, but my son was on a med for ADHD, and I did not like it. I didn't like the effects, so I was like, yeah, we're done. So I found more Focalin, which was a little more designer and didn't have the same effects. And before I said that, I was telling her what happened. He had some depressive modes. I said, this is not normal. I don't like it. I want to get off it. And she offered a second medication to help with that. And the first thing I said to her, I said, well, what's the mechanism of action? And she just looked at me and she went, so I know that I've given it and I've watched it work. And I'm like, yeah, that's not happening. Because like, if I don't know how it works on my kid, again, back to my child, like I'll probably take whatever, but back to my child.
Right.
Yeah, that's not happening. So she was nice.
It's not her being ignorant. It's
No.
us literally as a scientific community not understanding.
Not
how
understanding
it works.
it. Yeah, exactly.
So many of the medications that are prescribed are like, oh, we accidentally discovered that it helps with, like
I worked
like
OB.
Viagra as like a vasodilator for your heart. Oh, it turns out it does something else. That's how so many of our medications are prescribed.
Misoprostol, yeah. Cytotec in the OB world. I mean, half the drugs that we used in the OB world were not FDA approved for labor and delivery. It's not. It's just like it was not. When you use like terbutaline, that they found that it actually stops, contractions, and that's not what it is. I think it's a beta-2 adrenergic or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's supposed to work for the lungs, and we use it to stop pregnancy. And misoprostol, Cytotec is another one. So yeah, but I mean, that's
like you said, people are demanding more.
That's exactly the bottom line.
I think that comes as a byproduct. We can circle this all the way back to the beginning. Access to information that people didn't have before the advent of the internet, and now that social media is what social media is, and now that TikTok is what TikTok is, you can be logging in to watch cute cat videos and come across information that you never would have found otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why the standard is changing, because people are empowered to question the experts in ways that they couldn't have done previously.
Well, I think I'm going to honor this time because I'm watching the clock very carefully for you, because I know that she has a long day today of lecturing. So I was like, I'm going to honor this. But I think that's the thing that we need to end on, is that you get to advocate for yourself. And I tell people all the time, like, I'm very comfortable advocating, but I've been in the field for a long time. Like, I may not actually be actively nursing anymore, but once a nurse, always a nurse. Can't kind of take that out of you. So I am very comfortable questioning. Like, I'm like, so, and we'll have a talk about it or whatnot. And I don't ever I don't think I've ever really run into somebody like purposely trying to like blow me off or tell me I'm wrong or anything like that. I think most people had been pretty good, but there's also people that are just trained in a way that's just doesn't work for me. I mean, I had a nurse practitioner that she did her treatment by the numbers. Oh, your numbers are great. Well, why do I feel like this? No answer. That does not work for me. She gets highly touted. I see all the time, oh, she's amazing. I'm sure she is, but not in my world. My world, I want to know why. I want to understand. And
Yes.
that's just the end of the story. So if you can't come to the table with me to help me understand, when I went into neurofeedback, I didn't know what I was doing. I was like, somebody referred me. I was very intrigued. I am bringing my son. I'm like, I'll do it with you. Cause I thought we were like some science experiment. Right. And the person that did our neurofeedback, who I still actually collaborate with on different things now, he sat there for 2 hours and explained everything to me. I'm like, okay, so that is the person that I resonate with. And I'm like I swear to God, I'm his unofficial marketer because I refer everybody to him because he will talk to you and not in a like, I'm up here, you're down here, but let me explain what we're doing in a way that people understand. And when you understand, you buy in, right? That's when you buy in.
Yes. A good practitioner, there will be a level of mutual respect between parties because it's your body that's being treated and nobody knows your body the way you know your body or your mind for that matter.
Exactly.
So anyone worth their salt is willing to answer your questions. And if you feel like you can't or shouldn't ask those questions of a practitioner, it's the wrong fit. They may be wonderful, but you need to have the chemistry where you can be able to speak freely and ask the questions and advocate for yourself because good practitioners like that.
Yes. And so just to bring it all the way back around, like you need to do this for yourself. There's a lot of modalities out there. If you're struggling with it, look at your kids. Look at the people around you. Even if it's not your kids, even if it's just people around you, who are you impacting? Do you want to do it better? Because there are ways you can do this better. And that's what we're here to do is bring all these resources to help you do it better. So, all right. We got like 1 minute. What are your last words?
I'm just so grateful to have been given the opportunity to come here and chat with you. The majority of the people I talk to are in the child development world.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you sort of bringing me more into this world and understanding what's going on with our war veterans and the support that they need. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you, and I'm grateful to all of the veterans who are, paying the price for the sacrifice that they made.
This is important. I can't thank you enough. Like, I swear I was so excited for you to come on and I just couldn't wait for this because I knew I would nerd out and I would sit here and talk to you for 2 hours straight up. I could go on and on. I know. So, all right, everybody, we're going to wrap this up. As you know, Beyond the Front Line is under Coming Home Well, which is our parent podcast. And we always give a shout out to them for giving us this platform. And we always put a little plug for our CHW radio stream. It's 24/7. We have that going on. Go check it out. You can go to cominghomewell.com and you will see radio stream and you'll see all our podcasts. And you just click of a button and you can listen to a whole bunch of podcasts and you can listen to a radio stream. It's super awesome. And me, of course, I'm always grateful for you guys listening. We don't do this just to hear ourselves. I don't even like my voice most of the time. So I do it for you guys. And we want you guys listening. We want you guys getting the resources. And if you have questions, just shoot an email. You can go to, I think it's cominghomewell@gmail.com. It will come to me. I'll get that. They'll send it over. And we do answer questions. So from all of us here, Beyond the Front Line and our parent podcast, Coming Home Well, we hope you have an awesome week.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Front Line, a podcast of Coming Home Well. Join us every other Wednesday. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well.